So welcome to the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing. I'm about to hand over to Terry, who will be giving a lecture on literary theory, an overview, or possibly a retrospect, depending on how you view these things. And then we'll be having questions, at which point please do take part either using the chat bar or just raising an electronic hand. And if you'd like to turn your mic on to do that when you give your question, that's lovely, and or stick your camera on. Okay, so I will now hand over to my colleague, Professor Terry Eagleton.
Thank you, John. I suppose that literary theory, as we know it in its modern form, really emerged in the late 1960s. It reached a high point in the 1970s. Still around in the 1980s, but it began to wane in that period, and towards the end of the century, in other words, and then dissipated quite quickly. I think that those dates are significant because that period was really the last period when the political left was, in some sense, in the ascendancy. It's the last time, it's the most recent time that that's happened. And I think that the rise of literary and cultural theory in complex ways was tied in with advances, new kinds of militancy, new forms of insurrection and so on the left. And all that made it a very controversial matter. I mean, it may not be obvious now to those of us who study literary theory, but really when it first emerged, it was a highly disputed affair, very controversial. There was a lot of blood on the seminar room floors, some of it looking suspiciously like my own. So why, one asks, was there this furore over something which only concerned a few 100,000 not very important people like us, like students of literature, teachers of literature, whose contribution to the national economy probably ranks only a little bit higher than that of the penguins in Chester Zoo. Well, one reason I've suggested already why there's been this alarm over it, because it was clearly the intellectual expression of various radical political forces, but also I think because for those who didn't like it, for those who opposed it quite vigorously at the time, the phrase literary theory was almost a sort of oxymoron or contradictory, self-contradictory phrase. Like, for example, another oxymoron, military intelligence, or even better, business ethics. Centres for the study of business ethics really belong with centres for the study of unicorns or elves or whatever, mythical creatures. Why should the phrase literary theory be oxymoronic? Incidentally, Samuel Beckett once said that he had a strong weakness for an oxymoron, and the word oxymoron, you may know or not know, is itself an oxymoron. It comes from the ancient Greek for sharp and stupid, oxymoron, stupid as in moron. Anyway, why should it be oxymoronic? Well, because on this notion, the idea was that theory concerns itself with general concepts, whereas literature is about sensuous particularity, individuality of various kinds. Theory is systematic, whereas literature supposedly has the elusiveness and indeterminacy of life itself. In fact, you might argue, literature as we now know it arose sometime in the late 18th century, as I was saying in a lecture this morning, arose partly as a form of resistance to kinds of public discourse which were growing more abstract and bloodless and alienated, science, certain kind of philosophy, political economy, and so on. So that the very idea of literature or the imagination represented a protest in the name of lived experience of how things actually felt and tasted against what was seen to be a rather bloodless Enlightenment rationality. Among other things, that's a rather fancy way of saying that literary types aren't really very good at what's ordinarily called thinking. You know, they tend to be affective, intuitive, imaginative instead. So how then can there be a theory of that which is supposed to undermine the theoretical, the literary in its sensuous particularity? Well, theory or science does indeed deal with generalities. There can be a science of spiders, for example, but there can't be a science of an individual spider. Sociologists are not really very interested in individuals. But notice that literary types, literary critics and theorists deal, of course, with language, and all language is inescapably general. So there isn't any simple opposition between theory as abstract and universal and general on the one hand, and literature as specific and definitive and concrete on the other. I mean, as somebody has pointed out, the words "I love you" are always, in some sense, a quotation. You can't say "I love you" to somebody without it being in some way a quotation, which doesn't in the least mean it's not sincere, just that it's been said millions and millions of times before, like almost any piece of language. A phrase like "this indescribably awful pain I'm having here at this very moment," yes, is stuffed with generalities. Almost every word in that sentence, including "this" and "here," are generalities. Indeed, you might say that all signs, verbal or otherwise, are general in the sense that to be a sign, they have to be, as it were, portable from one situation to another. We wouldn't give the name of a sign to a mark that only ever happened once. There can't be a language simply for my experience alone. In fact, I can only identify what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing, because I already have been brought up within a language which I share with a lot of other people. There are no unique experiences in the sense of experiences which in principle only I could have, or only you could have, as opposed to experiences which only I happen to have. Literary works sometimes create the effect of sensuous specificity. Think of Keats or Hopkins or Donne, but this is a kind of verbal deceit. Certain literary works go to work on language in ways which generate the illusion of sensuous specificity. Another way of looking at literary theory is that you can see it in a way as the coming to self-consciousness of some sort of practice or some kind of activity. I mean, for a lot of the time, our activities, our social practices bowl along without feeling any particular need to think themselves through. But from time to time, a practice, social or intellectual, comes unstuck, either for some reason that is internal to it or for some external reason or for both. It begins to run out of steam, it begins to fray at the edges, start to come apart. And so in order to carry on, it has, perhaps for the first time, to begin to rise to self-consciousness and take itself as the object of its own inquiry. And that is what happened with the emergence of literary theory. When that self-consciousness happens on an epidemic scale, as it did back in, say, the 1970s, you can be sure that something's gone wrong. You can be sure that that's a symptom, in the Freudian sense, which says, you know, dig here and you'll find that there's something awry, and the theory is simply, as it were, symptomatic of this fact. Theory then is a practice, an activity, which curves back upon itself, yes, and forces its assumptions to some extent out into the open. Now that's quite difficult and sort of in a way dangerous, because most of our activities depend upon a certain repression, yes, of what we're actually doing. I mean, like, you can only ride a bike if you don't really think too much about it. In any case, we can't fully stand outside ourselves and objectify all of our latent assumptions. It would be like trying to pick ourselves up by our own bootstraps, because some of these latent assumptions constitute our very forms of subjectivity, so that to grasp them from the outside would be like leaping outside one's own skin. So only by excluding a great deal from our consciousness, as Freud teaches us, can our consciousness actually work. Our consciousness depends upon a certain salutary repression of all that went into its making. Now, theory in any full sense then, total absolute self-reflection is an illusion, I think, but theory in some fairly low-level sense of the term goes on all the time. I mean, we unconsciously test hypotheses, in daily life, but when, as I say, theory with a very large T breaks out in a dramatic way, then you can be fairly sure that this is symptomatic of something that's gone wrong. And I think that in the case of theory, the theory we're talking about, what went wrong, or what seemed to be wrong, was something to do not in the first place with literature, but actually with the role of the humanities as a whole in modern society. Note, incidentally, that this moment of thinking oneself through, theory, practices thinking themselves through that we call theory, isn't at all necessarily radical in its effect. I mean, it may simply be a question of getting the practice in question back on rails, as it were, resolving a few problems and carrying on much as before. You can now go back and reread everything from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf, but now in feminist or structuralist or semiotic terms, which will keep you going for a good few years and will keep the inspectors off the university's backs. Or the theory may indeed reveal that for some reason you simply can't carry on any longer in the way you were doing, and therefore you have to redefine and transform the whole territory. You have to try to dredge into consciousness assumptions which regulate what you're doing, and doing that, as I've just said, may have the effect of disabling those assumptions, in which case we have to establish a new set of them, which in turn, in time, will no doubt become unconscious and seem spontaneous and habitual, and then might again, at some future point, therefore need to be estranged, to be brought to light, to be reflected upon, and so on, in a potentially infinite process. As Freud teaches us, our natural condition is one of self-oblivion, is one of amnesia, is one of being opaque to ourselves. One of the staggering insights of what you might call late modernity, not confined to Freud by any means, is that we are not, as we used to think, as Descartes used to think, for example, transparent to ourselves. It's not a question of our being transparent to ourselves, but opaque to others, or others being impenetrable to us. It's a question of being impenetrable to some degree to ourselves, simply by virtue of being human subjects. Remembrance for Freud is arduous and painful, and sometimes traumatic, which is why we don't like to do it. Remembering is simply momentarily forgetting to forget, which is more of our natural state. Well, let me go back to the question of why this happened to literary criticism some time ago, literary theory being, as it were, literary criticism thinking itself through again. Lots of answers to that, I think, but an important one, as I've just touched on, is because of a general crisis of the humanities at this time, back in the later decades of the last century. Literary theory in the modern form breaks out roughly in the late 1960s, at the time of the Vietnam War, of the civil rights movement in the States, of student insurgency in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world, and sizable increases in higher education. A newly heterogeneous, a newly mixed body of students were entering higher education who couldn't any longer be presumed to spontaneously share the assumptions of their teachers. A certain consensus on which education, I suppose, is built was crumbling away. Also, the humanities, which were considered to be, and this is a long tradition inherited from the early 19th century, to be the very model of disinterested inquiry, non-partisan, non-sectarian investigation, were unmasked in this very politically turbulent period as being either locked into various forms of military and political violence, with which, say, universities, laboratories were complicit, or floating somehow ineffectually above these things with nothing very significant to say about them. The 60s also, one reason for the student revolts in the late 1960s, which spread rapidly across the globe and sparked political protest elsewhere outside the university, that's very unusual. I mean, it's very rare that, as it were, campus uprisings then spread to wider non-academic institutions, but they did in this case. And one reason for those protests was that it was the very beginnings of the kind of managerial and technocratic transformations of universities which have now taken over our universities almost entirely. So that, universities today are almost entirely service stations for the capitalist economy, and the humanities hang on by their fingernails, as it were, still raising the question of what they're doing around the place. And that, as I say, I think, is the question which originally motivated the rise of literary theory. There's also the fact that in that period, the increasingly central role of popular culture in social life as a whole shook a rather cloistered academia to the core. The word culture could now no longer be confined to the classical and canonical and academic. It was the colour of everyday life. It was the taste and feel of a society as a whole. So what I would argue is that theory, as we know it, springs not from so much a crisis in literature, how many people are going to lose sleep over that, but from a much more fundamental interrogating of the role and function of the humanities in an advanced capitalist society in which they increasingly seemed either like simple window dressing, or else, as I said before, actively complicit in various forms of deprivation and oppression beneath their air of disinterestedness. So what was at stake wasn't really just how to read Chaucer or whether Ian Fleming should be up there with John Milton, but the nature and function of a humane discourse or set of humane discourses in a social order which tipped its hat, as it were, to such values, which needed them, as it were, as an ideal version of what those societies were about, but which had very little time for them in practice. So the phrase, I've been really using the phrase, the crisis of the humanities, or thinking about that. And one problem with that phrase is it's a cliche. How many books now bear that title? For example, Crisis of the Humanities, the late 18th and early 19th centuries were born in crisis. They were born as an attempt to preserve certain creative, imaginative, affective, intuitive values, but increasingly in isolation for an emergent industrial capitalist society. Britain is the oldest capitalist society in the world, which seemed increasingly hostile to that kind of creativity in its everyday, pragmatic, utilitarian values. So the humanities were born in crisis. Crisis and the humanities were born at a stroke. They go together like ant and deck. And I say ant and deck just to show you that I'm not a stuffy, out-of-touch intellectual. The humanities emerged, let's say, at roughly the same time as early industrial capitalism, and they found themselves then hopelessly caught between either trying to provide that system with some sort of rationales, some spiritual explanations of what it was doing, or launching a critique of it, but a critique which was always from a certain academic distance and therefore tended to be rather ineffective. Now, by the mid-20th century, when certain kinds of theory began to emerge, this settlement was beginning to break down. Yes, the liberal tradition of disinterested, non-partisan inquiry was beginning to look more and more hollow, and one of the products of the breakdown of that consensus, that settlement, as I say, was something called theory. Yes, I'm trying to give you time for questions here if you want. Oh yes, let me just say quickly, one way you can think about theory, as compared, say, to conventional literary criticism, is that for the theorist, criticism doesn't start far back enough, yes? It takes too much for granted. So let's say criticism asks about the meaning of a poem, but theory asks what we mean by meaning, tries to push the process one stage back. In that sense, it's a kind of meta inquiry. Criticism asks whether the novel is boring, whereas theory asks what is a novel in the first place. Criticism ranks the play or poem as superb, whereas theory asks by what criteria do we make those kinds of judgments, and are they set criteria or do they vary historically? Imagine, for example, that you were witnessing a piece of art that was profoundly alien to you culturally, let's say some medieval Japanese drama, yeah? What could you say about it? You could say that it was boring or colourful or fast-moving or action-packed or repetitive. What you couldn't say is whether it was any good. And you couldn't say that because you wouldn't have access to the conventions and criteria which determined the answer, what counted as good in that particular time and place. There is a special kind of theory, special group of theories, which includes, say, feminism, socialism, queer theory, which are generally described as emancipatory theories. And they have some rather interesting and special qualities about them. They actually blur the distinction between knowledge and practice, between knowing and doing, between describing a situation and prescribing some form of action, because what they involve is a sort of collective rewriting or redescribing of one situation, a redescription, a rewriting, which can then become an active force in transforming that situation. People who are in unpleasant and unwelcome situations need to know how it is with them, not as an end in itself, but in order to be free of it, so that knowledge and power, knowledge and action come a side of the same coin. Once that is accomplished, if it is accomplished, it follows that there's no need for theory anymore, so theory can wither away and die. That means that that special class of theories, we call emancipatory theories, are self-abolishing. Their aim is to do themselves out of business by helping to bring about the conditions which will make them redundant. In that sense, being a feminist is not like being a phenomenologist or a semiotician. If there are still feminists around in 20 years' time, it will be an enormous pity. And I say that, I don't mean by that what the editor of the Daily Mail would mean. The only good reason for being a socialist, for example, is to get to the point where you can stop being one and just lie around all day wearing loose crimson garments, sipping absinthe and reading Dante in various interesting postures of jouissance. You create the conditions, so you hope, in which your own critique is no longer necessary. Let me just finish by saying that I began by saying that the emergence of modern theory is profoundly coupled with a widespread political crisis. But it also happened, the early works of, say, Jacques Derrida, the early works of Michel Foucault, it also happened at a point where the radical forces that were part of that crisis were beginning to be rolled back. So a certain disillusionment on the left was already setting in at that particular moment. And one of the roles of theory, therefore, was, as it were, to keep the revolution warm at the level of language, in a substitute kind of way, to try and cultivate those ideas, but increasingly in separation from political action. That wasn't the fault of the people who were involved in that, but theory was a kind of aftermath, yes, of that particular kind of insurgency. I might even, you'll be delighted to hear, stop at that point, except just to add this, and then we're almost at the half hour. By the 1990s, postmodern culture thought that it had effectively superannuated, got rid of, dismissed grand theories, grand narratives of a conceptually ambitious kind. There was no need, it seemed, for them anymore. There was no need to think through Western civilization to its very foundations, as some theory had tried to do. You could get by, so it was thought, with a mixture of pragmatism, cultural relativism, anti-foundationalism, and a sort of rather complacent consecration of the status quo. That was the situation, I think, around the turn of the century. Theory was increasingly unfashionable in universities. A spirit of general anti-theoretical pragmatism, relativism had taken over postmodern culture as a whole. And then what happened? 2 aircraft slammed into the World Trade Center. And a whole new grand narrative, if you like, between a certain distorted reading of the Quran on the one hand and advanced capitalism on the other, broke out at just the time when some theorists in the West were rather smugly announcing the so-called end of history. But in a way, so theory in a sense was back on the agenda. That struggle was going clearly to set the political agenda for a long time into the present century. And West faced with an enemy which has no difficulty with the foundational or the metaphysical or the absolute, is now forced back upon a sort of pragmatism and relativism, which in the end really won't provide it, in my view, with the resources that it will need. Thank you for listening. If anybody wants to raise any startling, unanswerable questions, then please go ahead.
Thank you, Terry. Yes, unanswerable or answerable. Now's a chance for anybody that wants to tap to either raise a hand, to indicate they want to offer a question, or alternatively to whack it into the chat bar. So I've got one hand here. I can't see who it is, but whoever's got their hand up, please turn your mic on and or your camera and fire away.
Working. Hello.
Hello.
Yep.
Yeah, we can see you and hear you.
My name's Phoenix, and I'd just like to say that was really, really interesting because I've not been aware of this before. And could you possibly let me know, is there sort of a beginner's book to literary theory from this aspect?
Well, there is. Sorry.
Is it going to be recorded so I can look back at it?
Well, there was a very fine and very brilliant book published about it many years ago. Very, very simple to read, startlingly illuminating, called Literary Theory: An Introduction, but the author's name escapes me. But actually, since my pioneering, unique contribution to the area, there have been umpteen books. Actually, I don't know how many of them are very good. But that book of mine, which is contains a bibliography at the end, which might guide you towards certain other works that might be useful to you.
Thank you very much.
That's all.
Thank you, Phoenix. So just raise your hand or put it in the chat bar. While we're waiting for a second question from the floor, as it were, let me ask Terry, you talked about the Twin Towers and the effect that had, as it were, on reigniting theory. Obviously, the theological seems to come back in the door. Some people say, aha, that's the point at which theory had its religious turn. What would you say to that?
Yes, I think that's a good point, John. I mean, I think that it's interesting, isn't it, that since that moment, a lot has been recast in religious terms. Just to the point, I mean, the sort of pragmatism and relativism, anti-foundationalism I was talking about in the West was, of course, part of a general secularization. It was assumed rather smugly, I think, by the West that was the way things were globally. Yes.
Okay.
And then it became alarmingly, tragically clear that wasn't the case. At the same time, very interestingly, in the first couple of decades of this century, a new kind of militant atheism has broken out in Western society. My old pal Christopher Hitchens, for example, is partly one of the authors of this, and also that man whose name I can never remember, but whose wife used to act in Doctor Who on television. An Oxford Don, I never remember his name. Dinkins, Ratkins, was it? Dawkins, yes, Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, whose brand of rather 19th century atheistic rationalism has become quite popular with some people. It is interesting, John, that that's an example of the West, as it were, being forced to argue about very fundamental values and not just take them for granted under the impact, under the pressure of an Islamic enemy.
Thank you. Got a question here from Amy Foster. Amy asks, what do you think the next school of literary theory will be? Are there any particular movements, schools of thought, which are gaining traction apart from the emancipatory movements?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, I quite often get this with a clairvoyant question, like Amy's just raised. What does the future hold? And as she says, as John says, leaving aside the emancipatory question, I would have thought that you could easily invest in green theory, surely, we now face the most dangerous crisis that humanity has ever known. And if the humanities has nothing to say about that, then it must be somehow bankrupt. So I would suggest that. I would also suggest it may be time to go back and look at some of the theories that are now not very popular, like semiotics and hermeneutics and phenomenology. They became, they lost a great deal of ground as postmodernism and post-colonialism began to rise. I must say, however, although this is mentioning the emancipatory theories, what did perhaps above all keep the radical flame alive over the period in which theory and the left in general took a downturn was the women's movement. Now, it often wasn't as radical, as militant, let's say, as it had been around the early 1970s, but there was a certain political continuity there, and that is partly because, of course, all the most important theories are not just theories. I mean, I've mentioned semiotics, hermeneutics, phenomenology. They are purely intellectual practices. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's a category mistake, as the philosophers would say, to lump those with things like feminism, socialism, anti-colonialism, which are not in the first place theories, but ways of behaving in the world, of which theory is an integral part.
Thank you, Terry. Okay, another question in the chat bar from Joanna Orphanide. I apologise if I'm getting that wrong. Joanna writes, I was interested in the Japanese example you brought up. With that in mind, do you have any thoughts on the study of literary theory through the lens of global literature, or perhaps how a more diverse student body should be approaching those areas of research?
That's an interesting and difficult question, a complex question. I think one gain in literary theory, going back a few decades to its high point, was that it really was at its best a sort of international language. I mean, certainly I've been all over the place talking in those terms to people in the way that, say, you couldn't simply talk about English literature in Nigeria or in Malaysia or wherever, not so easily, but it provided a kind of, because it was a sort of meta language, which was partly independent of specific cultural and literary idioms, it provided a kind of way of talking which many people globally could join in with. And that, of course, accompanied, let's face it, globalization in its less positive senses, the increasing sway of the transnational corporations over so many aspects of the lives of so many communities. So there was, I think, that kind of advantage to it. It was a situation which, in a curious way, reproduced what had happened at the high point of modernism in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. Modernism, which of course was quite often the project of exiles, emigres, vagrants, outsiders, people with one foot in one society and one foot out, Eliot, Joyce, Conrad, Pound, James, Wilde. Almost all of the major names in English modernism are exiles and emigres of one kind or another. That meant that was in many ways quite unpleasant. One shouldn't idealize or romanticize the life of an exile. Maybe okay if you're Joseph Conrad, but not if you're escaping from Syria. Yeah? On the other hand, it did force those people to develop a kind of lingua franca, a cosmopolitan tongue. So they would all meet together in various cafes in various European capitals or in New York, or wherever, and develop a certain sort of discourse, which was no longer the discourse simply confined to the nation state. Some of them, in a rather hubristic way, imagined that the nation state was now finished. Just then, the most virulent form of nationalism that the 20th century has ever seen broke out at the heart of Europe, Nazism. So there's no way in which that kind of language can simply surpass the language of nationhood, but it can begin to, begin to transgress the barriers or the limits of that in ways that are useful.
Thank you. Terry, you were talking about emancipatory theories and then other kinds of theory. If we take the other kind of theory, how would you meditate on it, brood on it, just read it, as it were? How would you read its kind of pointlessness, its kind of otherworldliness, taking deconstruction as the classic example, its kind of delight in itself and its endlessness? What does one say about that or do with it?
Yes. If I say too much about that, John, I'm going to exhaust what I'm going to say tomorrow about uselessness.
Oh, yes.
But you're right. I mean, I mentioned the word jouissance, a kind of key word for post-structuralism, enjoyment, pleasure. I think one of the gains of some theories was it put, and certainly of feminism, was it put that back on the agenda. Theory had a tendency to perpetuate the sort of grim male intellectual syndrome, rather bloodless and non-humorous and non-pleasurable. And theory began, I think, and certainly, as you mentioned, John, deconstruction began to explore questions of pleasure, whose whole point really is that they exist for themselves, as you say, for their own self-delight. In that, theory was the inheritor of a long romantic tradition from the late 18th century throughout the 19th century, for which the importance of the point of the work of art was increasingly its pointlessness. In a society which was able to turn everything into cash value or into utility, art led a precarious existence as that one of the very few enclaves in social existence which was its own validation, which was an end in itself. So that the artwork which turns in upon itself and takes itself as its own subject matter is implicitly political. That's sometimes not understood by those who dismiss that as a mere aestheticism, but to do that is itself a gesture of rejection and denial, and much high modernism, think of Beckett, thrived on that situation.
Thank you. Greg Clark asks, insightful talk. Thank you, Terry. Do you have any thoughts about literary theory being taught at secondary school? What would you say is the most important way in which young people 16 plus could have access to these theories?
Well, I do have thoughts about that, Greg. And I actually, over the years, have had quite a bit of correspondence with say, sixth formers, even occasionally fifth formers, who had a genuine interest in literary theory and wanted, to ask certain questions about it. I think there are ways of teaching it at all kinds of levels. There's no one fixed way of doing it, just as there are ways of teaching, say, religion at different levels. There's a way appropriate for little children, and so on. That would be rather like the enterprising project that Jacques Derrida carried out, certain groups that he formed which fought for the retention of the teaching of philosophy in French, in the lycée, in the French grammar school. Philosophy, of course, has a most distinguished and precious role to play in French culture, and that was being threatened, and there was a kind of defensive action which Jacques Derrida, I think, led, or was one of the leaders of it. I don't know the outcome exactly of it, but I think that would be an analogous situation, to encourage people, young people, whose assumptions perhaps are not yet so firmly fixed, as the academics who oppose literary theory had very fixed assumptions, who are still more fluid and flexible in that way. Perhaps that's a very productive level at which you can teach it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Grace, please. Or is it Nicola? Sorry, Nicola, Grace.
Hi, yeah, it's
Nicola.
Nikki. Thanks, that was absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed that. Thank you. And I was just wondering about the role of Marxist theory. If you could, are you still a Marxist, and what is the role of Marxism? Because I don't think you actually specifically mentioned Marxism in your talk. And there's a second part to the question, which is about what I've only recently kind of come across this term, but the fourth industrial revolution, about AI, about the the extent to which our lives, I think it's happening under our noses, really, that we are actually already, this fourth industrial revolution is already underway. So what's the role of materialism and, Marxist theory?
Yes.
Only tiny questions, obviously, but thank you.
If we have 3 days to talk about that, we should be doing pretty well. No, I didn't mention Marxism actually, but put it this way, in the period I was talking about, say around the late 60s, early 70s, of the left's ascendancy, there were a lot of people who were, if not, card-carrying Marxists, at least felt that sort of discourse made sense of the world, just as one feels that, say, Darwinism makes some sense, even if you're not a specialist in it. That altered, of course, and the reason for that, I think, wasn't exactly that Marxism ceased to be true, or even that some of the people who abandoned it thought that it was no longer true. They thought it could no longer work. The forces opposing it were too strong. The labour movement was rolled back by the capitalist state, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan and their successors, and there was a deep disenchantment, which is to some degree reflected in certain aspects of postmodern culture. It wasn't that Marxism itself had, if the Marxist analysis of capitalism was true in 1973, then it's very likely that it was still true in 1983. But actually, increasing numbers of people had deserted that camp, not, as I say, I think, because they didn't believe it anymore, but because it's very hard to maintain a belief which you can't see coming to fruition. It takes a lot of faith and tenacity to do that. And a lot of people, therefore, abandoned it for sort of understandable reasons. I personally, I must say, I'm not that worried. I don't lose that much sleep over whether people are Marxists or not. What I want people to be is socialists, and socialism includes a very varied range of beliefs, of which Marxism is one, a mainstream one, to be sure. But Marxism is a fairly technical discourse, What's important, I think, is to develop a critique of the situation that we're in globally, and Marxism has been a tremendous contributor to that. But I don't require that people sign on the dotted line as far as that goes, as long as, they share that kind of critique. On the question of artificial intelligence and so on, this is, I'm not exactly the best placed person to answer questions about recent technological developments, because I make a confession now, which I hope won't go outside your own rooms. I've never sent an email in my life, so I'm not actually at the very cutting edge, the white heat of technology. I belong to that tiny persecuted minority of people who don't use the internet. Pretty soon they'll put us in freak shows, so that people can prod us to see if we're real. But let me put it this way, just one comment on that. The question of artificial intelligence is, of course, very deeply tied up with the intellectual level, theoretical level, with what some people call anti-humanism or post-humanism. Now that is, I think, a matter of great theoretical and political importance, because most theory, as I say, has been about the humanities indirectly, and of course the humanities assume that there's some kind of value in the human. Some forms of post or anti-humanism don't make that assumption. So there's a very deep controversy going on there. Let me just make one point about that before closing. To think that there's value in the human doesn't entail believing that man, with a large M, is the lord of creation. Too many post-humanists and anti-humanists assume that those two things go together. That to see humanity as precious is to see it as unique and transcendent and superior to other species. Yeah, there is certainly a sense in which humanity has superior capacities to, say, badgers or goldfish. For example, we are so creative that we can actually create weapons of mass destruction. How clever of us. Badgers can't do that at all. So yes, we're certainly different in certain ways from the other animals, but not always by any means in ways that are to our advantage or in ways that are beneficial. So I think the question of humanism and anti-humanism needs rethinking as part of the AI question.
Thank you, Terry. Got a question here from Laura, but Phoenix, his hand's been up for a while. Is that an old hand, Phoenix? Or if it's a new one, then please do fire away because it's been up for a while. Oh, thank you. Thank you for getting back. Okay, Laura, this asks, how can we reconcile a tragic humanism perspective with radical political action?
Oh, very interesting question. I wish I knew the answer. Well, in a certain sense, I suppose I've been arguing in certain recent, stunningly brilliant books of mine. I recently, as Laura may know, published a book on tragedy, and before that a book on the idea of sacrifice called Radical Sacrifice. In a certain sense, those two things for me go very closely together. A tragic humanism means roughly the kind of affirmation of the human which can survive staring in the face the very worst of humanity. That's the only humanism for me that can have any value, as opposed to some rather cheap and glib assertion of the value of humanity, which hasn't been tested in the fire, in the crucible of tragedy. Tragedy asks the question, what, if anything, of the human survives the most traumatic forms of confrontation? Maybe in some cases nothing, but maybe in some cases, something comes through. Maybe there's a hint of a resurrection after the crucifixion, but unless you confront the fact of crucifixion, you sure aren't going to get to anything other than a kind of sham or bogus continuation of life. So that is also, for me, a way of describing radical action, because radical action involves a sort of self-dispossession. We are all deeply invested in our present selves and in the status quo, and we're being asked what is almost impossible, to leave that behind and to venture out into the unknown, into a future that nobody can pre-program or predict, for the sake of justice and freedom and equality. And that's a perilous thing to do, and it can have tragic consequences. We've seen that in the 20th century. But unless, I put it this way, if the situation we're in weren't as bad as it is globally, then we wouldn't need that radical level of self-dispossession. The fact that we need it is itself tragic. Would that we didn't. Would that we could put things to rights just by a bit of reform here and an application of a cosmetic there. But we can't. And a difference between, I think, radicals and others is the answer to the question how bad it is. We think it's pretty bad, and that's not pessimism, that's realism. Yeah? And therefore it demands a kind of breaking and remaking, both at the personal and at the political level, about which tragedy, as well as radical politics, have a great deal to say.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Terry. Question here from Ted, as we hit with 5 minutes to go. What are your thoughts on post-critique in relation to what you've spoken about today?
Yes, important point, I think, Ted. I have a lot of time for it because, as I said before, there was something about high theory, which was rather sort of grim and dire and intimidating, whereas post-critique, or some of it, is trying to put the enjoyment of reading, the pleasure of reading, the self-realizations involved in that back on the agenda. And I think that's fine. And that's an offshoot of feminism in a certain indirect way. I don't think, however, that one can superannuate, one can surpass critique. On the contrary, as I argued at the end of my remarks, in a certain sense, it's more necessary than ever. But critique has always to combine itself with a more positive or utopian moment. Unless you have that utopian moment somehow included within the critique, you don't really know what you're criticizing in the name of. You're criticizing for criticism's sake. And post-critique can remind us very usefully, very valuably, of those moments of pleasure, moments of affirmation, which are not easily theorizable. I once heard Jacques Derrida say that he wasn't against dialectics, but he was interested in that which was non-dialectizable. Well, I think one could say the same in the case of critique and post-critique. Well, it's not against critique, but there's always that which there's a residue it tends to leave out. And the best of traditional literary criticism, however anti-theoretical it may be, is that it does in its own way savor that dimension of criticism.
Thank you. We've very nearly run out of time, so I will thank everybody for their participation, whether that be through questions or otherwise, and we will, as you know, there's two more events, I think, yes, to go this week with Terry, so you'll find all those on the department website and or Eventbrite. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a very good day. Bye-bye.